let's keep trucking. So this next bar is going to be kind of the end of that first phrase. So here we have an interesting non-chord tone situation. So we have a D and an A. So the reason I skipped right over this is that if you listen to this part, you can really hear that this B feels like a non-chord tone, and then it resolves to A, which is the chord tone. So I'll play that for you in just a second, but that makes this a D chord. Okay? For the first 2 beats, this might be something different. But listen to how this feels like it resolves down to A. This is like a hanging note, and then it falls and lands on A. I'm going to start from this bar over here. Right? It goes da-dum, like this just kind of glides down into that note. So that feels like a non-chord tone to me. So D and A really feel like our note here. So in the key of G, D and A makes a 5 chord. It's a good way to end a phrase. So now we have a D chord, a D and a C. That's an interesting thing. Still a D. Let's for now call this C a non-chord tone, but in the next big section of this class, we're going to talk about 7th chords. When we talk about 7th chords, when we learn 7th chords, keep this particular case in mind because this is one of them. For now, let's call this C a non-chord tone, but really, it's a 7th. More on 7th chords very shortly. What do we have here? B, A, B. Now this A is really quick and in passing, so I'm willing to right off the bat think of that as a non-chord tone. So let's see if B and D work together in some way, maybe with a G. Well, we know that G, B, and D is a 1 chord, right? So let's call that a 1 chord with A as a passing tone. It works again right there. There's another A, also a passing tone, right? So I'm pretty comfortable calling that a 1 chord. Let's move on. Now here we have another one where we have 3 bass notes. That could be an indication that there's more than 1 chord in the bar. Here's an A and a B. Now those are a second apart, right? Those are a whole step apart, A and B. So they're not in any chord together, any chord that we know of yet together. So this is one of these is a passing tone. C on a weak beat and then D. So this looks like the third we have is B and D, but the A in the bass works well with the C because that makes a third, A and C. Let's suspend judgment on right here until we look at the rest of the bar. Here we have a G and a D right on top of each other. So that looks like a 1 chord. Here we have a B and a G. That also looks like a 1 chord. So that means, could this be mirroring the thing we saw up there where it was a 5-1 situation? So that means A, let's see if this works as a 5, because we saw this pattern before, right? Of 5 on the first beat and then 1 on the rest of the beat, on the rest of the measure. So would a 5 make sense here? That would be D, F, and A. F sharp, sorry, D, F sharp, and A. So here's an A, that's good. Here's a D. At the start of the next one, D, F sharp, and A. It kind of does work, and it's hard to explain why without talking more about 7th chords. So this C is in the chord if it was a 7th chord. So trust me on that. We're going to get into 7th chords shortly. But because of that D, or that C, we're going to call this B a non-chord tone and call this another 5 chord. It's a little bit of a weird one. I'll talk more about that when we get into 7th chords. But that means this is 5 and then this is 1 for the rest of the bar. Moving on, I'm getting really excited about getting up to right here because then things look interesting right here. So let's keep going until we get there. Here's a G and another G that looks a lot like 1. C and an E. That looks a lot like it could be a C chord, something based on C. Let's look over here. That could be a 4 chord. Pretty likely, that would be a good choice. So we'd have a 1 chord, and then a 4 chord, and then another C that works really well in with a 4 chord. D right at the end of the bar, let's call that a passing tone. So here we have a 1 and then a 4. Now this C carries on all the way over to here, so that means we count it as though it were played when we're analyzing something. So here's C and E again, so still a 4 chord, very well could be. F sharp looks like a passing tone. Let's see how that plays out. D and G. That could work out to be a 1 chord again, because our 1 chord is G, B, and D. So here's a B, here's a G, here's another G, and here's a B. So we can call that a passing tone if we want. Moving on, A. This is just like over here, except different notes, but similar pattern. So in that case, we threw out that note as a non-chord tone. So let's call this an A. Oh, and then we have a G at the top. Another interesting one. And I say that that's interesting because those are a whole step apart, A and G, right? So let's see what happens when we look at the whole bar. Here we have an A and a C. That leads us to think about, could be a 2 chord, could also be, here's an A and a C, a 7th chord, or a 7 chord, a diminished chord. It's possible. Let's see if it works as a 2 chord, slightly more likely. A, C, we would look for an E, which we don't have. We have another C though. Since A is in the bass, I'm okay calling that a 2 chord. Taking us back here. You know what could be happening right here? We could very well be on a 1 chord here, but this is our passing note because here's G, and then this becomes a chord tone in the new chord. So we could call this 1 with this as a passing tone. That's weird, but I think it makes the most sense. And then we're back to our A chord here, our 2 chord. All right, now something interesting. Here we have a totally out of the key note. This is a G flat. That makes no sense, right? G flat. But it kind of does. It kind of does make sense. Let's not think of it as a G flat. Let's think of that as an F sharp. Same note, right? F sharp is in the key of G. So if this was an F sharp, we'd have B and A. And, well, let's just look at just those 3 notes. F sharp A is a 3rd. Where do we have an F sharp and an A? Here's an F sharp A. We have that on a 5 chord, actually. So F sharp A, D is a 5 chord. 5 is a very common chord. So we could call that a 5 chord and then a 1 chord. G, B, and then another B. So another 1 chord. That totally works. Let's just finish out this section, these last 2 bars, and then we'll break to a new video for the second half of the piece. Okay, B, A, another major second, so probably G is what we want. G and B makes a 1. C and A, C, E is a chord. A, C, E, that could be a 2. So that could be a 2, and then back to D, B, and A, probably D and A, because that would get us to a 5 chord. So that's a interesting bar, but what happens there is that what we're doing is setting up kind of a turnaround. We're setting up to go back to the beginning because of our repeat here. So chords sometimes start moving around a little bit faster to get us back to the at the end of a phrase. So what do we got here? D, F sharp. So that would be a 5, G, 1, G. So 5, 1. Very, very, very common to have at the end of a phrase a 5-1 progression. We'll talk more about that in the future when we talk about how chords relate to each other, and particularly the circle of fifths and how that works. But very common to have a 5-1 at the end of a progression. And that's what we have, 5-1, and then we go back all the way back up to the beginning. Okay, so let's assume we repeat that whole thing and then go on to part 2, but let's break to another video and then we'll look at part 2. We've got a lot of really interesting stuff here because we've got these C sharps, and I can't explain those by switching it to a D flat or anything like that. So something interesting is happening here, and I'm going to tell you right now, just to pique your interest, that we are modulating to a new key. We are temporarily going to be in the key of D major right here. So we're going to switch keys very briefly, and then we're going to end up back in G. So interesting stuff of a little bit of a key change there. Okay, let's break, and then we'll do the second half. Off we go.